Welcome to Climate Courage. My name's Andrea Edwards.
Hello, I'm David Coe. Richard, you want to?
Oh,
That's Richard.
Thank you so much.
He's looking. Yeah.
Yeah, you froze there for a bit. All right.
Yeah, I hope it wasn't me.
That's okay. That's okay. We can move forward.
Yeah.
This is the second time we're here together with you, Andrea.
Yep. Well, it's about the fourth or fifth actually. For Climate Courage. Yeah.
Yes.
And today we are really, really happy. We've got a very special guest, Robin Hicks, and I met Robin in a former life in Singapore many, many years ago. And he's been a journalist for more than 20 years, working in the UK, Singapore, Hong Kong, Australia, Indonesia and Malaysia. So he really understands what's going on the ground in this part of the world. And he's also works for a charity called Acres. So tell me, Robin, if I got it wrong, but it's a Singapore-based animal welfare charity. And according to LinkedIn, he's had some pretty interesting encounters with snakes. So here he is. Welcome, Robin.
Thanks so much for having me, Andrea. Nice to meet you, David and Richard.
It's great to have you here.
That sounds like a really interesting story about snakes. I'm going to have to hear it at some point.
Yeah, well, that's what I do on the weekends. It keeps me sane. I mean, you think, Singapore's got a reputation for being a boring place to live, but certainly not if you're being spat at by a spitting cobra or chasing a snake. There's amazing wildlife here. Just a lot of it is hidden. So you get huge pythons here, for example, but you just can't see them because they use the canals and waterways to swim around. And they're usually a couple of huge pythons lurking beneath, say, a hawker centre, because there's lots of rats. But what's, I don't know, I guess difficult is the level of the biophobia, right? The resistance or reluctance to accept the natural world or biology as part of the city living experience. I think it's similar in other cities, right? Hong Kong and other places. People just aren't used to the natural world, which is a shame in Singapore because it is, I think the BBC said it has the highest biodiversity of any city on the planet. It's just, we don't often see it.
Yeah. I remember when the otters came back in Singapore, it was magical. And now they're everywhere, right?
Yeah, I mean, the population's expanding to almost worrying degree because they get the population, because once they cleaned up the river and the waterways around Singapore, the otter population came back from Malaysia and has exploded. And now otters are expanding their populations, actually getting into fights over territory. And they keep stealing rich people's koi, which is quite amusing. They keep raiding people's koi and just going on massive killing sprees. And
that's so funny.
What's worrying actually is that at one point they'll start to be cold. But what I think, and that happens to macaques and other species in Singapore, the level of tolerance for animals or wildlife in general is low, I'd say. And once they become a problem, the government will have no hesitation in culling. But the thing is with otters, what protects them is they're extremely cute. So they've got that cute factor, whereas long-tailed macaques aren't quite as cute, so the public aren't as worried about them getting cold. But it'd be interesting to see, as the population expands, the level of tolerance for otters and how that changes.
Yeah, I used to, when I rode my bike to Microsoft, I used to stop and watch the first otter family, just playing around in the dirt. It was awesome. And just to be in a city and to see something so magical, Australians, where I grew up, you'd see wildlife every day, kangaroos running across and stuff. But it's very cool to see it in a city. All right, so Robin has got an hour, and that means we're going to have to be focused. But like we did last time, let's start off with what's going on in the news that's really got your attention at the moment. And I'm going to presume Antonio Guterres' announcement about fossil fuel advertising has got a few people's attention, especially yours, David. So do you want to talk about your perspective?
Yes. I actually I was in the cinema a few months back. I think we were watching, it was Taylor Swift's Eras Tour. That was being streamed in cinema.
Yeah, you got a teenage daughter, right?
and it was, the tour was great. But before that, they had this UN advertisement with young children from around the world talking about how the world is all going to pots, basically. And it had these sort of really flashing red images of burning Earth with lovable young children from around the world saying, save our future, all of that in there. And the problem is the dissonance it creates is just impossible. And what you end up feeling is you're just being rammed with a message. There's no opportunity for any kind of open conversation about it. And yesterday's announcement from Gutierrez comparing fossil fuels with tobacco is actually a really bad thing to do. There is absolutely no need for tobacco. You know, if you want to get addicted to something, there are plenty of things you can addicted to. There's actually no need for tobacco or along the chains of production along the way. But fossil fuels needs a really genuine open conversations because people's lives depend on it. And we have to reduce them, but you're not going to get that conversation by just going off with some black and white message that says somehow implicitly that everyone is bad. It's just not the same thing. So the UN and Antonio Gutierrez, who's trying to forge this message forward about how we need to cut the emissions, and what we need to do, what he needs to be going forward is to say, imagine a new market where you can actually keep oil, gas, and coal in the ground. You know, go back to Taylor Swift, right? And I had this idea, Richard and I had this idea, we were talking along and said, you know, we were having a conversation with a friend of ours, Vincent. And we're thinking about how can you create a new market? And he says, well, what happens if, you know, imagine Pandora Jewelry, the biggest jewelry company in the world. When you go and buy your daughter a link, they ask you, do you want to take part in a lottery? If you win in the lottery, what happens is that you get to meet Taylor Swift on stage in one of her concerts. And you go and say, oh, how do I do? What do I do to sign up? And you say, you've already paid for it. We will take a fraction of your money, 1 day's worth of our revenues, and we'll commit it to keeping oil and gas and coal in the ground on your behalf. And you just need to sign here to say you want us to do this on your behalf, and you get a chance to win, to be on stage with Taylor Swift. And every time you buy, you get a chance to enter again. And that's a much more imaginative way of engaging businesses which use the oil and gas and coal, the consumers who knows there is an issue with it, in a way that says, actually, we can shape it in a way that benefits everybody, rather than go around having messages that just turns this into an impossible brick wall.
No, I'm not sure about the Pandora's sort of as an example, because it's just more consumption, which that's my little red flag there with that. But the brick wall and that point that you made right at the beginning, we need fossil fuels, whether we like it or not. We need them. We're just using too many of them. But Robin, you've worked in the marketing PR comm space as a journalist, so what did you think of that? Like, how do you think the industry is going to respond to that?
Yeah, interesting. So I'm trying to write a story on that today, actually, trying to get the 5 big holding companies, you know, WPP, IPG, Havas, and the other guys to respond to Gutierrez, what he said, at least come up with the position on it. And they've been very quiet. And I think we all know why, right? They will not, until they're legally bound to, until I asked an NGO in Australia about it. Australians are good on this sort of thing. And so what's going to push the big advertising majors away from fossil fuels? What will make them, what will persuade them to drop fossil fuels clients, if anything? And it will be regulation. It's not until it's legally mandated that you can't advertise fossil fuels that they'll stop working with them. But at the moment, only one of the big groups, IPG, which I think works for Exxon and a few markets, has said that they've come up with at least the rules of engagement for working with fossil fuels clients. They said that oh, well, yeah, we won't take on new fossil fuels clients. We'll only use the existing ones. And we'll work on a time-bound plan to phase out fossil fuels exposure over the longer term. But yeah, meanwhile, what's interesting is you've seen in Australia and in the US especially, you've got these interesting NGO groups as Clean Creatives and Comms Declare for Climate, which are trying to galvanize the advertising industry to make a pledge to stop working for fossil fuels clients, which I think is really interesting. But yeah, it's the legacy though, isn't it, of how they advertise their products and services that is so pernicious, right? I mean, they're the greenwashing masters ever since 1990. It was BP, British Petroleum, pretty much invented greenwashing, didn't it? In 1999, it came up with a campaign. It rebranded from British Petroleum to Beyond Petroleum. It changed its logo from a strong shield into a sunflower. And Greenpeace came out and said, look, guys, you've spent more on rebranding through WPP, I think it was, than you invest in fossil fuels, which is pretty much classic greenwashing. So yeah, it's just the legacy of misinformation and diversion that advertising agencies have done on behalf of the fossil fuels clients that I think that United Nations has a problem with, and I think everyone should have a problem with.
Yeah, so I suppose for me, when I heard it, it's sort of similar to what David's saying. I just did, like, if we're going to do it, so Edinburgh or Scotland, I think it was Edinburgh, announced that you can't advertise fossil fuels, the cruise industry, I think planes were included. There were a couple of other industries, and of course there's been attacks about the city being woke. But to me, like, if we really want to address the scale of the issue that we face, and that's the thing we're not doing, the scale, anything with fast in it, fast food, fast fashion, fast furniture, shouldn't be allowed to be advertising. So put IKEA in the mix of that. Obviously Cheyenne, Temu, all those nasty companies. I was just reading today in Bangladesh that because of the garment industry, which is such a major contributor to the GDP, and it basically brought the country out of poverty, and it's just basically polluted the entire environment with forever chemicals. So that's a priority. So to me, it's just it didn't go far enough. And if we want to reduce fossil fuels, we need to reduce the need for fossil fuels, and that's our clothes, how we eat, how we drive, how we move. It's all of it. So I suppose for me, they didn't go far enough. But then from an advertising, marketing, PR perspective, they're sitting there looking at their business models, and that's my background, right? And they need a diversity of clients and to keep people employed. And the biggest paying clients are the ones who are doing the biggest harm on the planet. So what's their business model moving forward when they're basically being told, not just for fossil fuels, but for all of it, like, how do they move forward as an industry? So to me, it's actually a very complicated topic, but it's a beginning of a conversation, I think. So I suppose that's in one way a good thing, and it's getting lots of attention. Richard, what do you reckon? Sorry, go, Robin.
I would definitely wholeheartedly concur with your last sentence, which is it's a starting point. I don't like the tone of what Gutierrez emphasized, because I don't think you're going to win a battle by vilifying the opposition or whatever we want to call the fossil fuel producers. And the aspect that we all touched upon here is like, if we shut it down completely tomorrow, you would have revolution and chaos in every country. You would have civil war, because nothing in our structure of the economy works without fossil fuels. But, my favorite quote on our addiction, if you like, and consumption of them is the interview they had many years ago with Mick Jagger about the 60s and the drug taking and why Brian Jones fell off the wagon and drowned in his pool. He said it was the 60s. Everyone was using drugs. Brian was just using too much. And I think that's how we need to see the fossil fuel. We're not going to be able to shut it down. We just need to use less and be sensible about it. And here, ultimately, these are individual choices we make. We cannot escape the responsibility from our own decision making and what we decide to put our dollar towards. Do we want to drive to the gym, or do you want to take a bike to the gym?
I think what the thing that comes out in many respects out of this is that when you're trying to come out, and I think the UN is particularly bad at this, at a piece of communications. You can't have it be something that turns into a meme so that you're ridiculed by the way you kind of do it. And the angrier Antonio Guterres becomes, the more he becomes meme-like. And his message is totally lost. And he's just playing into how, if I were a fossil fuel lobby, would want my opposition to play. Don't attack the actual use of the thing. Don't attack the actual exploration and extraction. Attack all the superficial stuff so that it just becomes something that focuses people attention away from the fact they're the ones behind why we burn over 102 million barrels of oil every day. Don't raise that part. Focus it so that you become meme-like.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of Antonio Guterres, and I think he has the best one-liners, so he's obviously got a good scriptwriter. But I think he's heading an organization that is designed to fail, and he's using everything he's got in his arsenal to help it succeed. And I'm seeing a lot of criticism for the UN and the body and its uselessness in the world, but we don't want to lose this body. I think we need this body, and we need to get behind it and help them be successful, because it's designed to fail. But before we wrap this point up, Robin, what do you think, listening to all these different things?
Just to add to that, yeah, I think I agree with you, Andrew. I love it's very quotable as a journalist.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? It's
Fantastic.
like, talkie again, it's bad to say something you can use in a headline, right?
Yeah.
But also, I do remember, showing my age a bit, but going back 20 years, I remember the UN trying to engage with the advertising industry 20 years ago. And their framing was a lot softer. They were trying to look, we're not disrupting a business model. We're not suggesting that you move away from carbon intensive industries, but can you frame it differently? I think their headline that they used was, can sustainability sell? So can you continue to do what you do, but just sell different stuff? Which I think is a different way of approaching it than obviously now, where Guterres has gone pretty gun-ho and basically calling them out for being corporate evildoers. But yeah, I think he sounds like a man who's had enough of playing nice guy. And UN, by the way, also have been it's the Cannes Advertising Festival in a couple of weeks, isn't it? You know, the annual shindig for the advertising industry. UN's been there every year. They've always had some sort of booth, some sort of presence, and it just feels like they're ratcheting up their pressure on the industry to do something, because the advertising industry does feel like a legacy industry that's going to change even after the fossil fuels industry will change. Because they're a services industry, that's sort of slaves to clients. And I do get the sense, and what you think, that marketing industry will be one of the last sectors to pivot to cleaner energy or less carbon intensive industries. That's why he's taken the tone that he has.
Yeah, I think the difference is it's a young industry typically, and I think the drive will come from the younger employees saying, we don't want to do this anymore. Well, I remember when I ran a team, they were constantly saying, well, Andrew, we don't really want to work for a company like this. We don't believe in their values. And I'm like, yeah, neither do I. We're not going to pitch for it, But that was unusual. And I think I lost a job because I wasn't willing to pitch for business that I didn't think had integrity. But that wasn't common, but I think it's become hopefully more common. But the other story that's really capturing my attention is the heat waves. Of course, in Asia, we went through 3 months, and I can't tell you the relief when that was over. Is it cooled down in Singapore yet, Robin, or is it still that intense humidity?
It's still pretty boiling. It's sort of always is. There isn't that much variation, but yeah, the edge, the sting has come out of it slightly.
Yeah, right. So the last few weeks here, it's just been cool. It's been raining. The life's coming back. It's been a real relief. But of course, we watched what was happening in the US and Pakistan, and I was frustrated by the media attention on that, because until we started to really get a sense of scale of deaths, the global media weren't paying attention. But we got lots of information out of Mexico when the howler monkeys were dying. But what's interesting about what's happening now with this heat dome is it's moving into America, and because it's been cool before, basically the people in the northern hemisphere, if they went through the heat extreme that has just gone through this region, which hasn't finished yet, it would be deadly. because the people in this region can cope with so much more heat to an extent, right? But what's happening now as it moves in, there's a MAGA rally in Arizona where there were 11 heat strokes patients that had to go off to hospital. I don't think anyone's died yet, but we're starting to see a rapid surge of heat, but also big numbers of people passing out due to heat stroke. Deaths are starting to be reported because they haven't acclimatized at all. They've gone from cold to hot. And so I think in the coming weeks, we're going to see some pretty extreme suffering in the United States, especially because we talked about it last time, electricity shortages because of storms that have hit in the past. So if regions are hit and they haven't got electricity and they can't get cool, they're going to be in trouble. It doesn't sound like they're prepared. There's 2 overnight cooling stations in Phoenix. 2. There lost 680, 668 or something like that people last year, mainly the homeless. No one cares. So, the reporting of heat, the number of deaths being reported, I think we're going to hear that thousands and thousands and thousands of people have died across India and Pakistan, maybe in 12 months' time when the next heat wave hits. But I think we're really going to be moving into that territory of mass deaths from heat. And I don't see it cooling down just because La Nina's coming in. I think it's going to keep going. So are you all paying attention to the heat extremes?
Yeah. I again, in that sort of softer angle, I think it's actually can be really effective. So I called up my home insurance. And it was because these cracks were appearing on the rendering of my house and they've been dry and so on, wondering have I got subsidence and stuff. And it's because, just the heat, thermal expansion, and then you get a cold winter and a bit of weathering and stuff. And the repairs that you need on your houses and places you live just increase your costs. And that just adds to your costs. So the problems in this way is actually it's terrible people living under heat, and I feel for them. But I'm paying the cost in my own house in where I am without even being under those extremes in that way. And the reporting just doesn't actually touch on what the consequences to our everyday lives are in the way that actually, I end up calling my insurer about it and having to pay the costs associated with getting it done and then sorting it back out. Those are the ways in which the climate disruptions get into everybody's lives. And I think that's really important as a part of that reporting, that the reporting isn't focused on the extremes because people pull away from the extremes. It makes them kind of that's too much. I can't cope with it. I'm not going to read that now.
Yeah.
But there's a bill I have to pay, and whatever happens, I have to pay it.
Yeah. Robin, what are you saying?
Yeah, so my publication, Eco Business, so we've done quite a lot of reporting around heat, mainly in Southeast Asia. And there's been a lot of talk about heat literacy and heat stress. So, and also preparedness. You mentioned that, Andrew, that we did a story on how poorly prepared a lot of Southeast Asian cities are for extreme heat. In the context of Singapore, the universities have done some interesting studies on heat stress and the impact of extreme heat on the human body. Everything from reduced fertility in men to lack of concentration, construction. People that the poor devils that actually work outside and actually are exposed to it. That's a reality in Singapore. It's, I guess, pretty interesting that the elites are inside, pretty much protected by air conditioning. It's the people building the city that are exposed to it, plus gig workers that ferry around deliveries. People can fall off buildings in this heat while they're constructing the city. So there's been a lot of reporting on that, which I think's been pretty responsible and interesting. In a Singapore context, what's frustrated me is a lack. We'll probably get onto this later, but not really seeing the bigger picture on extreme heat. One is a pet issue that's pretty close to my heart is I mentioned that the work I do around wildlife rescue is forest loss here. Not many people talk about it because it's a small island, but Singapore's still losing a lot of forest at a rapid rate. As we know, forests keep places cool, and losing secondary forest. No one cares about secondary forests here, because they're not nature reserves and they're seen as in-between land that will soon be developed. But there's been no serious studies that connects forest loss with heat. I think that's a lot of work that needs to be done, especially in urban areas. So yeah, it's been pretty scary. And Singapore's, as I mentioned, hot all year round, but it's been pretty crazily intense. And yeah, as I mentioned earlier on, it's an interesting segment on Channel News Asia last week, where a climate scientist was talking about the extreme heat in Singapore, and he was flanked by two news readers that are talking about La Nina effect, and wasn't it great that La Nina was going to sweep through and cool us down? And Professor Benjamin Horton, I think he won't be ashamed to admit, he got quite hot under the collar, if you pardon the pun, got quite angry, visibly angry, that the message just was not sinking in among these news anchors, that the problem was human-induced climate change, and La Nina was not going to cool Singapore down in any permanent way. It was just a temporary weather phenomenon. So that sort of, that interesting dynamic in the news of between what's immediately in front of us, what we're experiencing now, with the background trends, I think is something that a lot of news organizations struggle to deal with or story tell well.
Yeah. My frustration. So like last year I spent, I don't know how much time, I was tracking all of the heat waves across the world, looking at it all. I was doing, when do electricity grids fall over, what temperature? So basically from about 48, 49 degrees up, that's when they fall over, and the majority of electricity in Asia is above the ground, right? So it's even more in danger of collapsing. When do generators fall? And, you know, in Africa, that's a really important source of energy. Well, they start getting sluggish around 40 degrees Celsius. So how are the people in Africa going to survive if their only energy source can't work, you know? And there's so many simple things to do. You know, we drove from Phuket up to Bangkok last summer and back, and I was just looking for a white roof, just one, you know, somebody who went, I need to get prepared for this. I didn't see a single thing. And the construction workers, you know, in Singapore, they live in luxury by comparison. You know, it's literally tin shacks and dirt roads, you know, and those poor people have gone through so much in the last few months. And next year, it's going to be hotter, maybe as hot with the La Nina impact, maybe hotter. Like, we don't know. And so that Earth energy imbalance argument that Hanson's sort of talking a lot about, right? But it's going to get hotter, and we need to get ready. It doesn't all have to cost a lot of money. There's a lot of things people can do. Vegetation's a huge part of the solution. Singapore University has done a recent study on painting surfaces white, and it was a significant drop of temperature, you know, so there's some interesting, but we're not doing it. And it's here, it's now, you know, and that long-term view, that big picture view, where is it? It's just infuriating.
It's kind of puzzling.
Can I ask Robin, just kind of out of curiosity, you know, when you were talking about Professor Benjamin Horton speaking with the TV anchors or the journalists about that, you know, what I want to ask is, how much do you think that, how much are the journalists capable in terms of, you know, the resources they have or time they have and so on, to be able to inform themselves before they actually have to appear and then interview someone or do those things? Is that something which, you know?
Yes, it's a good point. I think a bit of a generalization, most journalists, if you're any good, can go from a position of relative ignorance, and with some research and talking to the right experts can knock out a story, right? But with something as complicated as climate science, I think you really do need to have an expert on the show to explain what's happening. Now, Channel News Asia, before Benjamin Horton came on, they put in a pretty detailed segment that explained the weather phenomenon, what was happening. But what they didn't have is that additional bigger picture layer, which explains human-induced climate change, which is a phrase that Ben kept saying repeatedly. As I mentioned, it was like he almost had like a tic. He just kept having to repeat himself, and came across as a scientist that really wasn't being listened to, or wasn't being taken seriously. But yeah, I think they had a decent level of understanding, but they just weren't joining the dots. and saying, yeah, this La Nina is not great because it's not going to cool us down for much longer. We're going to return to this background reality of permanently hotter weather.
Yeah. All right. So should we move into because I know that we could talk about the news all day, but let's focus on Robin. So we're going to go back to the beginning. You know, you've been a journalist for 20 years. So just a quick view of what drew you into the profession, but most specifically, I'm really curious to hear how it's been since you've moved into sustainability. And I suppose there's a couple of key areas I'd love to hear. Do you feel like by taking on this role, you're making a contribution? What are your hard days like? How do you keep your mind under control? And for anyone who thinks I'm overwhelming him with questions, I've given them to him in advance, so he knows what I'm going to ask. But would you encourage others to join the profession, especially right now at this point in time? So give us that take.
So just, I guess, start from the beginning. Degree in zoology. Like I really am I mean, everyone says this is in sustainability, but I am a genuine tree hugger. You know, I initially wanted to be a vet, but I don't think that's clever enough. It seemed like a lot of work. But I did a degree in zoology, University of Bristol, and I went on a conservation trip to the Philippines. It was a diving expedition, surveying coral reefs. It was wonderful, but I got pretty addicted to journaling about the experience, and that act of sort of writing stuff down and putting it down on paper, just, I don't know why, it just really appealed to me. And I went back after that and tried to get a job in journalism. It took me a year, it took me a long time to persuade an editor to take a gamble on some kid with a zoology degree. It's not exactly the most obviously transferable of skills from science into journalism, unless it's a specialist scientific field. But eventually an editor took a gamble on me at a publication called Media and Marketing Europe. And from then I got sort of, as a lot of journalists do, get sort of pigeonholed into a certain category that you write about. So that was 10, 15 years I was writing about media and marketing until a job ad came up, actually from, it's actually a friend that posted the ad. I actually knew of her. Jessica Chum, who's still my boss 8 years later, and I was friends with her husband at the time as well. And so I guess I was lucky that I interviewed for it with a friend, and so I guess it was less of a gamble because she sort of knew what I was like. But yeah, no, it took me a while. As I said, it took me a long time to get into journalism, but since being there, I could do and would not want to do anything else. So yeah, it's been 20 plus years. So yeah, so does it feel like I'm making contribution? Definitely not all of the time. Sometimes, I mean, there's certain issues that I think myself, my colleagues have made a difference on, even incrementally. Stuff like we put quite a lot of pressure on Singapore's big three banks to think seriously about coal and draw up conditions, pledges to step away from coal. We work with NGOs, put out some stories. And I do think we make a genuine difference of trying to move Southeast Asia's biggest three banks away from coal. So that's a story, or a bunch of stories I think that had a genuine impact. It's something of a sport, right? But I do really enjoy writing about greenwashing and expose it. I think any journalist does. It's fun, right? Calling companies out for wrongdoing is just a lot of fun, especially if they're banter rights and you can prove that what they're saying does not match with what they're doing, which I think is a huge issue in sustainability at the moment. Those stories are fun, and I do know that they've made an impact. But I've also been called out myself for being too critical and damaging the confidence of sustainability teams. They're just like, well, forget it, we're not doing anything, or we're going to at least not communicate what we're doing because we don't want to be slammed for it, right? I think that's a genuine issue. How critical you are and how much leeway potentially you give and how much you celebrate the wins of a company that's actually achieved something, right? So yeah, see, I think that's an issue that that's important to raise, that in journalism there is a lot of negativity, especially in this sector. I think a lot of journalists do always tend to focus on the negative. Rhett Butler, the founder of Mongabay, it's the world's biggest environmental website. He said that if you give a journalist a solution to write about, they'll always write about the 10% that doesn't work. It's just in their nature. And I'd agree with that. But, you know, there are positive news stories about that are not, and I'm sure you guys probably all agree, are not being reported on enough. I mean, just today, just at the top of my head, a forest twice the size of Hong Kong was legally recognized as belonging to indigenous peoples in Papua, right? That's a great story, especially with just seeing the change of government in Indonesia. Everyone's scared of Prabowo Subianto, a former military general. And also another story that definitely hasn't been in the news is Southeast Asia's biggest ride-hailing app has just seen a drop in emissions, which sound like a small-ish story, but to even start decarbonizing in a region like Southeast Asia, which is more bound to fossil fuels than almost any region in the world, I think is interesting and worth celebrating. Also, which has been in the news a lot more, but is good news, is a ban on the dog meat trade, which seems to be moving around Asia. And again, I think that's probably picked up a bit more traction because dogs are cute and cuddly. So yeah, there is good news out there, but it's definitely not given as much airtime as it should be, perhaps. And we, as journalists, are definitely guilty of that. What are the hard days like? Depressing. I suffer from depression anyway. I have for a number of years, and writing about emptying oceans and emptying forests does actually, that process of writing about it does help you distance yourself from it. It's a sort of cathartic process that does seem to make things a bit easier, but some stories are just like, Jesus, it does get too much on occasion. Yeah, it's really hard to bear. And that depression does turn to anger. A lot of stories, I'm sure that you guys feel the same, just make me really, really angry. One is corporate lobbying. There's something about a company trying to, like, for example, not picking on any name or any company in particular, but Coca-Cola. They have got a rap sheet, a formula of blocking laws which will make them pay for the pollution they create. That makes me extremely angry, and not trust or want to buy drink Coca-Cola. I mean, just stuff like that just makes me really angry. Also, companies like Shell rolling back climate targets, and they knew about climate change for years, and they're weakening already pretty unambitious climate targets. That makes me angry. But also the other topics that we cover that make me conflicted. One is deep sea mining. We need to have 10 times more transition minerals that are currently in circulation, but do we dig up the ocean floor to get them? I mean, it does sound like an extremely bad idea, but it's a trade-off that most sustainability stories, there is this sort of trade-off, and we have to make up in our minds. Same with fossil fuels, right? We need them, but we also don't want too many of them. So that's that conflicted angle to it. How do I manage my mind doing this work? Some months it's yoga and meditation and swimming. Other months it's booze. I mean, I don't care what anyone says. I mean, I've probably got quite an unhealthy relationship with alcohol. But I've met many people in my situation that are quite similar. I went out for drinks with a chief sustainability officer of a big Malaysian bank recently, and asked her, how do you deal with, burnout? I'm sure you've seen the cases there's a story we did recently about the job of the CSO, the chief sustainability officer, right? It's just broadening and diversifying so quickly that these people cannot cope. They are breaking down and they're leaving this very, very important job. And I asked her how you cope with it, and she said, alcohol. That's a coping mechanism, right? Plus, I tend to channel this, I guess, angst, frustration, rage into productivity. could be a touch of ADHD as well, undiagnosed. I do tend to put out a lot of content, which is possibly an unhealthy amount. I do work a lot, possibly too much, but I do see work as medicine as well. Like knocking out a story that you're sort of proud of is a way of dealing with climate anxiety for sure. And yeah, I mean, that sort of leads on to the last question you made about, would I encourage younger writers to join the profession? Without question. I mean, you don't do it for the money, that's for sure. I mean, it's not really a brag, but I've never really asked for a pay rise. I'm lucky to have any job at all in journalism. You know, the structural changes that the business is going through, that I'm sure we'll talk about later. You know, Google and Facebook has eaten advertising revenue. A lot of publications, good publications, have had to scramble around for different ways to make money. But still, even then, it is a wonderful job. And the satisfaction of putting out a story that holds a company to account or tells an untold story that you think needs to be told is a wonderful feeling. Yeah, it was. I'd recommend it to anyone.
Nice.
I think it's a wonderful career choice, and you know, with hindsight, you know, and a bit more encouragement, who knows if I'd gone down that route, because I think it's one of those things that aligns very much to enable you to do something you care about deeply and you're genuinely interested in. And I actually think, when I'm looking at youngsters, I got 2 of them in the 20s. One of them is definitely working in an area that interests her. The other one, yeah, kind of, you know, it's not bad, but it's not really what I'm passionate about. But if I look at all their friends, without exception, one, who is a doctor, no one is really working with what's interesting them. And I find that quite depressing. I was fortunate. I'm really interested in economics and, you know, finance and trading. So I set out my stall early on, and I'm grateful for that I was able to do 30 plus years in a field that genuinely interests me. But I am worried about youngsters that kind of have completely different perspective on what the career should look like. Because if you're not enabled to go into a field that at least you have some interest in, you know, you don't need to love it every second of the day. I actually don't think you're going to have a very happy life. And it's very hard.
Disappointing. Yeah.
Because you spend, you know, a lot of time with your work.
As we all know.
Well, I was going to ask Robin, you know, it's great you end up in this very positive kind of budding journalist. It's a great thing to do. There is, unfortunately, the other side where increasingly, you know, journalism is kind of quite a threatening occupation. It sort of needs a danger pay kind of thing with it. Yeah. I think there was a report earlier last month on the World Press Freedom Day about how environmental journalists and journalists of all kinds are being killed around the world. What kind of experience have you seen yourself of that? Is that something that you face? And, you know, what are the people or the industries and so on that are actually behind this kind of shift?
Yeah, so I mean, I'll talk about Singapore in a minute, where I'm based. But yeah, that report, I think, poor old the Philippines always gets labeled. I mean, because it's one of Asia's freest countries for the press. You can feel free to criticize whoever you like, but you may well get shot for it. There have been an alarming, consistently alarming number of killings of journalists in the Philippines over the years, and environmental defenders, which are helping to tell the stories about, mainly in the resources sector, so in mining. And a lot of that's being driven, by the way, by the drive for renewables, right? We need the transition minerals to put in wind turbines and solar panels and car batteries, including nickel, for example. I mean, half of Indonesia seems to be dug up at the moment by mining companies. Philippines, it's particularly dangerous, I think, because you've got this idea of red flagging. It's called red flagging over there, where journalists are labeled terrorists and can be persecuted that way. There's a lot of going after journalists online as well. That there a lot of hired trolling, apparently, according to human rights groups I've spoken to about the Philippines, that if for any sort of anti-mining sentiments, trolls will come out and produce a party line and then systematically persecute whoever's criticizing mining as a pursuit and activity. So yeah, the Philippines is full of a lot of incredibly brave journalists. I think in some countries, especially, I mean, I say Vietnam, especially Vietnam is a very, very difficult place to be a journalist at the moment. A lot of NGOs, climate NGOs, are being locked up for being outspoken about the government's policy on coal, for example. And being a journalist in Vietnam is nigh on impossible if you don't have government approval, and very difficult. So here in Singapore, I think it's also very difficult. It does not have a free press. For the Reporters Without Borders Press Freedom Index, that's one of the metrics for gauging freedom of the press. It's pretty much down there in the 150, something like that. I mean, none of Southeast Asia does well.
Right.
Yeah.
No.
But the Philippines does okay. I think Thailand is the freest, unless you go talking about the king, and then it's as dangerous. So Singapore is interesting. A journalist, I think I have an enormous amount of respect for a journalist called Kirsten Han, who's a fearless reporter about human rights, especially the death penalty. And she has been tremendously brave, but even she will admit that she self-censors. I think newsrooms in Singapore, especially for mainstream media, they will not go after establishments. So, I mean, I think it's unfair to say that, say, the Straits Times just publishes government press releases. I think there is more nuance to that, and there's a lot of good journalists there. It's the editors that will heavily edit their copy if there's any criticism of the government, especially, obviously, also government-linked institutions that are sort of holy cows for Singapore. For example, Temasek, which have its tentacles everywhere there. I don't think any journalist would be allowed to go after Temasek in any shape or form, to be honest. But even then, what's even more of a serious issue is self-censorship. So I think culturally in newsrooms in Singapore, there's a lot of journalists that instinctively hold back in their criticism of environmental crime or would never, I could be unfair, could be a bit of a generalization, but I don't think many journalists in Singapore would instinctively criticize, for example, openly the government for being too lax in its climate targets, for example. There isn't obvious, there aren't killings or whatever than there are in Philippines or jailings that are in Vietnam, but I do think there's definitely a culture of fear in newsrooms in Singapore that keeps journalists automatically in check without. But that's not to say, I mean, for example, I've written a few stories recently that are critical of the Singapore government in a number of ways. And they may seem like quite soft stories, but there's a huge incineration plant that got delayed. Again, this is a story that wouldn't appear in the mainstream press. People just wouldn't report on something negative necessarily happening, I don't think. Or also a story about Coca-Cola and a consortium of other packaged goods companies deliberately delaying the introduction of a polluter pays law in Singapore. So I was quite nervous about putting the story out, but the thing about it was it didn't make the government look bad. They did not lose face, which is the worst possible thing that I think you could do, journalists could do in Singapore, is the government to lose face, because you will hear about it. But this story, and what's important to do is that obviously the right to reply from the government is featured very high up in the story. I think that their argument is prominent in a story. I think that's just the license to do business in journalism here. You have to get, if you're critical of the powers that be, you would never run a story without them commenting first, unless you're asking for trouble, for sure. And as a story I was really excited about, actually, that I got from a very good source, about Singapore considering introducing, it's called solar radiation management. So injecting lots of sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere to control the heat here. Now, I'm not saying, before I get into trouble, I'm not saying that is fact. I got it from a pretty good source, but the Ministry of Sustainability and the Environment denied it. They said this is not happening. And so I'm not sure what I can do with the story. They've said it, they've denied it. So it's probably unlikely that I'll run the story. So that's just an example of how to, I guess, play the game in Singapore, right? You have to be careful, but that's not to say that you cannot get stories out that are critical of important people and institutions as long as they're balanced.
Yeah. Hey, what's your status? So you PR, citizen, what pass? S-pass, right? So
Yeah.
obviously, even in Thailand, so we're on guardian visas for our boys to go to school. But if I actively criticise the country, the people, do something, or especially if I criticise the royal family, we'll be booted out, and that's common knowledge, right? So I think we've just done the two questions there, and that I had. The next one for you, Richard, I think we've covered them, but there is a risk. But I think it's also another. When you read the news that comes out of this region, I think it's really important to put the lens on top of that news that there is a subtlety to it, and I think all news should be looked through with different lenses based on where it's coming from, and whether it's far right, far left, whatever. Every media deserves a lens, but in Asia it's a different kind of lens. It's a lens of subtlety, and I don't think countries like America are very good at seeing that, the subtlety that exists in this region, because the truth is there if you look for it, right?
Absolutely. So I just pick on that. Yeah, you're absolutely right that Singaporeans know how to read the Straits Times, and that is reading between the lines. The story is not in the headline or the first 3 or 4 paragraphs. It's usually right at the bottom. The journalist has had to bury, or the editor's like, put that further bit down a bit. There are certain issues. I know 2 friends that have been kicked out of Singapore. One, a very good journalist for The Economist, who wrote about sand, which is an extremely sensitive issue because of where Singapore is the world's biggest sand importer, because it's reclaiming land, etc. But where sand is sourced from is from very environmentally sensitive areas, Cambodia, for example. So that didn't go down well. And another friend was booted out for writing about human rights. She referenced it was just a reference that she added to a story that was critical, from Harvard Business Review, that was critical of Singaporean human rights and foreign workers. So but the government was very honest with her and said, this is what you've written, we don't like it, and your work pass is no longer valid, so you have to leave. So I mean, I do really appreciate that transparency, that they were quite upfront about what she'd written about. The same with the sand article, and why it was not acceptable before they were shown the door.
That's both very interesting topics. So look, we haven't got much time, and I know you're going to have to jump off, so we could what do you guys want to finish with? We've got a few more minutes, because I think it's as people sitting on the other side of the world, you might have a different sort of view that might be interesting.
I think it's a great opportunity when Robin is here to use his experience and knowledge in the field, because it's a fascinating area. One thing that has struck me, and I actually prepared a bit for this show, is Singapore is an interesting case, which is very far down in press freedom. And, for the record, I think press freedom is absolutely essential. It doesn't mean you can attack people, in a defamatory fashion, but you actually need press to enable to express opinions without fear of being clamped down on. And for me, the biggest argument why that is a good thing for everyone, with reasonable understanding of financial performance, look at the list of press freedom, Singapore being the exception, and look which stock markets have performed best over the last 30, 50, 70 years. if you don't have press freedom, you could argue you're going to struggle to have a well-functioning economy and get actually performance. Because all the countries that have had absolutely terrible performance, they're at the bottom. Singapore's performance has actually been pretty good, and it's like 25th or something over the last 50 years in terms of. So it's a little bit, and I think what you're telling me is also, it's a different kind of game. It isn't explicit censorship, because you look at the countries with censorship, you're not going to have a functioning economy, and you're not going to have a functioning stock market. So why do you want to be poorer?
Yeah, right. It's like the fight for equality. Everyone wins. You know, that's a really interesting perspective, because I think it's going to add to something. The way that the media works in this region, because of the government sort of level of control, does it also mean that there's less misinformation, disinformation, fake news, because there's more control? So I think for both sides, that's kind of interesting. Economies work better if you've got more freedom, which does that play out? I mean, if you look at the last 10 years, the countries with the most freedom, when the most extreme sort of division in media has sort of erupted, you see the right side of the media versus the left, and the right's so much bigger. Is the economy supporting that argument still? I don't know. What do you think, Robin?
Yeah, interesting one. The context of the environment. Someone said the other day that in the media in many countries, there aren't many spin doctors for the environment, but there are plenty for business and establishments, right, and governments. I think that's true in many countries. So it's difficult to find that balance. Forgive me if I'm not touched on the point you raised at all, but and also I look at Indonesia. Indonesia's an interesting one, super important. It's Southeast Asia's biggest, most important economy. Their media is relatively free, and I'd say, I mean, journalists do get into trouble. There's one journalist, Phil Jacobson, got arrested just by attending an Indigenous peoples meeting last year. But generally, I think the media there have done a really good job of calling out some of the ridiculous things that their politicians say around climate and forests, and have done a pretty good job. For example, I mean, the palm oil lobby is very strong in Indonesia, as we know, right? And the politicians have made some crazy arguments that a hectare of palm oil plantation is at least as good as a rainforest at locking in carbon, for example. This rhetoric that comes out of the palm oil producing nations is quite crazy. And I think Indonesia media has done a better job of calling it out than the Malaysian media, for example. But yeah, sorry if that didn't touch on your question at all. What was your question again?
I was kind of two things. It was freedom of press equals better economies, stock markets.
Yeah.
And is the lack of freedom of press does it handle the disinformation, misinformation wars? So are the governments better off here at dealing with that than other parts of the world?
Yeah, no, I think that, absolutely. I mean, lower press freedom means that the nonsense that comes out of institutions like, for example, in Vietnam, for example, it just goes unchallenged by the media. I mean, that's the danger, right? Is that if Vietnamese government says coal is good, we need more coal, it's good for the economy, there's no way that any of the state-owned press will challenge any of that or any of the nuance in that statement. So disinformation. I always say about going back to Singapore, by the way, on the topic of greenwashing. Greenwashing for me, I mean, Singapore is an absolute playground for greenwashing for a number of reasons. You've got a fairly muzzled mainstream media that does not call out companies. The government is very pro-business here. And NGOs are very weak, stroke non-existent. So you've got companies here who basically have a free rein to communicate whatever they like with impunity, which I think is extremely dangerous. You've got companies that are making ridiculous claims that, for example, would be illegal in Europe. So Grab, the biggest ride-hailing app, claiming that it will be making a claim that will be carbon neutral by 2040. They will not say on how much of that target is based on carbon offsets. the carbon offsets they used have been widely debunked by Greenpeace and other institutions. But yeah, you just don't see it challenged. You do not see what they're saying challenged in the press enough. So yeah, I do think it's a huge issue that disinformation is not called out when there's an unfree press.
Well, if you want to see someone calling out disinformation with elegance, I would suggest following Robin on LinkedIn. You're really good at it. You shared something from Reuters yesterday, sponsored by ABN AMRO, about the Guterres comment, and I thought that was very clever. But yeah, you usually entertain me, but I know you need to head off. So just want to say thanks so much for joining us, and keep up the good fight. We need to be supporting journalists. I think too many journalists are being attacked, when the reality is the journalists are doing a great job. It's the publishers who we should be focusing, not the people on the front lines doing the work, because there's great risk in the profession, and we need people who are capable of calling truth to power, right?
Yeah, if you get absence of proper investigative journalism, all you're left with is basically opinions and unsubstantiated claims, and for a better word, cheerleaders, because you cannot actually support factually what you are out there propagating. And I think it's an extremely dangerous world. And I think what you described with sort of Facebook and Google eating into advertising space, if you run a paper, of course, you're somewhat sensible about who you're going to publish if one of the companies that you're writing an article about is your main contributor in terms of advertising revenue. However, without that revenue, you will not have investigative journalism, because it costs to keep journalists going, and we as a society needs to start thinking about what we're actually paying for. If all we're ready to pay for is opinions, you will not have facts to be able to even sustain those debates or sustain a show like this where we are expressing opinions, because we need the facts, and the people are going to unearth those facts. They need to be paid for the job they do. And I think that's worth thinking about in a broader societal context.
I'd like to sort of, throw out questions before you leave, just to put it out there, which I think is actually an important one, which is for the reader, for the audience you write to, and not just yourself, but other people along. What should they think about, or how should they go about thinking whether the piece they've written is a cheerleading piece, or is actually something that's something more than that, or otherwise?
As a journalist, do you mean, or is it just anyone writing?
As a reader, you as a journalist, what would you suggest to the reader in terms of maybe questions they can ask themselves after they've read a piece or whatever it is, so that they can be better understand whether they've actually read is a cheerleading piece or whether it actually is a helpful investigative journalist piece? Yeah,
that's a really good point. I think I was talking to a couple of journalists before the show, actually, and they do. I mean, there's one thing that there's a lot of, I guess, sloppy journalism out there. To Richard's point, you have to good journalism has to be paid for. Investigative journalism is very, very expensive. And with shrinking advertising revenues, there's dwindling sources to pay for good journalism, right? There's some foundations out there that pay for investigative stories, but they're certainly not in the mainstream. So, yeah, I think sort of news literacy and how to discern what's a good story and what is a factually accurate story is really important. But I think there's a lot of news readers that are quite lazy. I mean, the consumption of news, as we know, is pretty much falling off a cliff as it is, as people pivot to social media, Instagram, TikTok, and that sort of thing. But yeah, I do think there's decent climate reporting out there. You just have to look for it, and a lot of it's a mix. You'll get, say Reuters, for example. That's a pretty. I mean, I had a pop at them yesterday for that, as Andrea mentioned. They had a sustainability newsletter, and in that newsletter, they mentioned Antonio Guterres' comment about, he's talking about media not taking sponsorships from fossil fuels anymore. And that very newsletter was sponsored by the American Chemistry Council, which is a fossil fuels lobby group. So I think as a news reader, you have to really scrutinize what you're reading and take a lot of time to certainly not read it from one source, I'd say. But there is good news out there that goes into depth on an issue. You just have to look for it and know where to look for it. DSMOG is a pretty good title. I'd say a lot of them are specialist titles. So I think you have to prepare, if you want to get to know a topic as, say, complex as climate science, you have to roll your sleeves up and be prepared to also wade through some specialist journals, not just Ecobusiness, but Carbon Brief, for example, is a really good journal, alongside the mainstream stuff that will just take the I guess, just summaries of the news. So yeah, you have to be prepared to dig to get to the bottom of the story, I'd say.
Yeah, so I've just put up my link to my weekend reads, which is basically exactly what you're saying. I just bring everything together that I'm reading, watching, listening to, and put it in one place to make it easy for people, because I know it's complicated for people to navigate the information overwhelm. So I've been doing this for years just to try and help everyone, because it's so important that we understand this and we stop being overwhelmed by it, and start to look and read and understand what the big issues are. Rather than all the bullshit that's going on around the edges. And and that lack of news, so younger people aren't reading the news, like you said. That's really concerning, right?
Sorry, how do you aggregate that news? So what tool do you use where to bring it all together?
That's me. It's literally me. I don't use. Everything I read, watch, listen to, I just put it into WhatsApp chat. Once a week I sit down and put it into this platform, so that people can just see, just go through and look at the headlines, if nothing else, so they know what's going on. And it covers it basically covers the polycrisis. So it's every aspect of what's going on in the world. But there's some funny stuff in there too, because as you know, I got a sense of humor. So, but it's for that. And anyone else who's good at navigating news, I just really want to encourage them to be out there sharing. There's a handful of people everywhere on social media that are good at doing that. And listen to them, But we should let you go, Robin.
Indeed.
Yeah, I've really enjoyed that. Thanks so much for having me. Thanks, Andy.
Thanks for joining us.
Chat, David and Richard.
Been a pleasure.
Yeah. Take care. All right. Have a good weekend.
Take care. All right. Bye.
Bye.
Oh, there you go. Wow. Some good stuff. And I think there were 4 or 5 other questions that we didn't get to, but
time is short.
That's all right. Yeah, but, and who knows where it's going to go. But I think I really wanted to, so I would like to at some point bring a couple of different journalists, maybe Robin, back and really talk about the business model of media, because you were talking about it there, Richard. How the media makes money is really, really important, and advertising is obviously huge, right? But it's also puts pressure on them, or whatever the publication is, to create content that's in alignment with the companies that are spending the money, right? So, and ever since social media, it's just been really interesting to watch how the news sources have changed, and they've changed. Clickbait, got to get eyeballs on to get the numbers, to get the advertisers, and none of it's been in our interest.
Absolutely not. And I have this huge fear, right? I touched upon it earlier. I think press freedom and degrees of economic freedom are essential if you want to build wealth. That's what encourages entrepreneurship. It encourages growth, etc. Now, I always think there will be space, because there will always be a certain demand for specific publication in particular subject areas where people are prepared to pay, and actually pay quite a lot. And I think the financial industry is an example of that, where you have some very, very targeted sources of important information that charges phenomenal amounts because it's expensive to dig into these stories. But what's happening with mainstream press and mainstream media, where the vast majority of us get our broader information spectra, is that essentially you have eradicated what I would describe as proper journalism in favor of opinions. And if an opinion gets repeated often enough and broadly enough, it's being perceived as actually being the truth and the wisdom, and this is what actually is the case, because it's not being attacked and debated properly by the people who are prepared to unearth the facts, because the big newspapers and the big TV channels, all they're doing is essentially fire proper investigative journalism in favor of people writing opinion pieces. And I think it's a very, very dangerous route and path forward for mainstream media, because I'm sure it's going to become a backlash at some point. And it's actually not particularly beneficial to society at large, who needs fact finders to be able to actually form our own opinions. And it's not helpful that you've been handed a whole generation who clearly struggles to absorb news in a proper fashion and watches TikTok and think that's news. That's not helpful. But I think that can get approached and tackled through other means. Fundamentally, people, I think, like us here, needs to understand that if you want facts and figures and proper journalism, you actually need to pay for it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you take Truth Social and what's going on at the moment, and what you're going to find is we're being swamped essentially by the businesses and the interests wanting to broadcast their messages in the way that they can make sure it goes out in the way they want. So independent journalism, which is basically defined by the fact that you may not like what they say, but they'll interview you and they say what they think you're saying, and what it means. In that way, it's increasingly difficult to sustain, to continue, because the people with the money increasingly want to be in control and create their own media channels to do that. So the days before where you would have 2-3 broadcasting channels in each country, and whether they were independent or state, there was, take the UK, there was an independent one and there was a state public one in that way. And there was a remit in the state public one for it to have a mandate which was independent in that form, is being displaced. It's not actually being attacked and removed. It's simply being displaced by more money spent on creating their own channels that draw their own audiences into increasingly kind of small echo chambers of views. And that's really for me the danger that we face. It's not that the investigative journalists don't get paid. Obviously, that's the consequence of it. But they don't get paid because we increasingly like listening to conversations that actually help reinforce our view. And we we're uncomfortable with things that makes us think, well, actually, you know what? I really felt strongly about that, but now I'm having to think again. Whichever side it is, whichever side that might be.
Absolutely. I find it so interesting, like being in an echo chamber. I'm regularly sitting in a very uncomfortable place with the media I'm listening to, watching or reading, right? Because I don't only want to hear what other people have to say who disagree with me. I want to understand the words they use. I want to understand that real, the underlying layers underneath. But the most important thing is I'm always challenging what I think is right. Because if I'm wrong, I want to know. And so I suppose maybe we need to get a psychologist on or something. But just why, like Truth Social. I was going to go and join it just to keep an eye on it because I would like to stay informed. But Twitter's still good enough for that side of life. But could you imagine what that environment is like, where everyone's there for the same thing, and it's this outrage, and you could just imagine in their bodies this constant sort of they'd be in this constant fight or flight mode, and everyone agrees with them. And I personally couldn't think of anything worse. Could you?
No, it's absolutely awful, right? And
we have, sorry to interrupt, that we have an extra, it's from a news article today of a report basically about the consequence of the AI is we run out of independent pieces. Everything becomes AI generated. So if you're a journalist, you start using the AI to go along, and if you're a lazy journalist, you start using the AI to beautify the piece. As soon as I start typing a post in LinkedIn, it goes along and says, use AI to rewrite it better. Yeah. And all those things. So the consequence of it is it reinforces all the echo chambers as we go forward. And just by, it's like one of these kind of population things, the invasive population of the AI just takes over. Even though you think I don't want to be within an echo chamber, all your sources are the product of an echo chamber.
Yeah. But I can tell I always say to people, like, having written a couple of books and blogs and all that sort of stuff, if you don't create the content, you can't understand the content. So this idea that you can go into AI and write a couple of sentences and then it produces a blog and then you tweak it with a few personal words, but you don't know what you're talking about. So if someone sort of stopped you on the street and started talking to you about your blog, you wouldn't have the depth, because it's the process of going through the creation of content that actually helps you understand it. Like when I wrote Uncommon Courage, there were some chapters, like when third review, how you go through the process of rewriting and rewriting and rewriting. And I was like, I've used a word, integrity, for example. Do I know what integrity really, really means? And so then I'd go and spend some time researching the word, and then I'd go and look at how I'd written. And sometimes there were things I had to change just a little bit because I hadn't used the word in the right way, and it's time consuming. Knowledge is time consuming, but we're in fast fashion, fast food, fast furniture. Now we're in fast knowledge land. It's like,
that's a frightening thought. No,
that's where we're going.
Yeah, but it raises the simple question. I think politicians are particularly guilty. But if you're in a position where you can hire people yourself that you are going to go on working with, I've been fortunate enough. I've been in positions where I've hired people. The last thing I'm looking for, and the worst thing I can imagine, is to hire a clone of myself. Someone with similar background, similar opinions, similar ideas about what, how the world works and how you should trade and how you should make money effectively, in portfolio management. I want to hire people who think diametrically the opposite of how I think, because that way I become better. Fundamentally, I don't become better at my job by surrounding myself by people who do the same thing and think the same way. When you look at politicians now, and it's different country from country. UK has a long tradition with very large civil service that surrounds the publicly elected ministers, etc. All they seem to do is hire people like themselves with the same background, the same ideas, the same thought process. And actually, it's not only a political failure. You look at most of the world's central banks, they've probably all gone to school together and they've all had Paul Krugman, giving a lecture to them at some point. I don't think that's a particularly smart way of operating in any form of organization, because the diversity of views and diversity of backgrounds and diversity of thought process that leads to is beneficial to the people involved. And still, when I look at my friends who are in the position of hiring people and we debate these things, because, I like a feisty debate about things that bothers me. They say, yeah, but you can talk about the cricket or whatever. It's like, that's not really the point of hiring someone. You hire someone that will be enabling you to do your job better. That is the privilege of being in a position when you are allowed to present someone with an employment contract.
Yeah, the problem I have with that, I mean, Richard and I, we come from very similar background. Our role effectively is to, how was it that was described? Basically, take money from people who are not just who just don't are not as smart as you are from the market. Basically, that's what it was about, and that's how you get into this place. But a lot of people's jobs are there to promote the product that they are employed to promote. And goes to Andrea's comment earlier when I mentioned about, you know, what if Pandora did something like that, right? The whole industry there is to promote it. The part of actually saying what happens when you keep oil and gas and coal in the ground is everything else has to retrench, because that massive source of energy goes away. So even for Pandora, it has to go along and says, actually, we can only buy into this if we're seriously willing to consider how our prospects of our growth, how we find our place with everyone else, because there will be less of that energy that we rely on. And that's the reason why they won't go for it, not because of the promotion, because they think through. And so if they do go for it, they will need to go for it with a story that actually says how they will still be able to be there for you. And that's the really important part. But most businesses are not required to think on that step, which is why we're having conversation, which is why we're having this climate courage issue, is because the climate issue, and Mike right with Antonio Gutierrez in the way he's presenting it, not with him, but in the way he's presenting it, is to make it look like it's just one layer.
Yeah.
Stop the ads and it'll all be done.
Yeah. But you know, David, the other thing that just drives me crazy about this whole conversation around fossil fuels. Okay, so tomorrow we stop all fossil fuels, right? There's all these implications that we all know. But the biggest implication is escalating heat. You can't just take all the pollution out of the ground and clean up the earth and move on, because you take all the pollution out of the earth, and we're seeing that. You know, there's a very clear track right across the northern hemisphere where the ships were going back and forth. They're taking the sulfur out of the ocean in that. And there's a strip of ocean at the north. Just the other day, I was reading China's massive reduction in coal use. They think that's a big part of the Pacific Ocean heating up like it is, right? Yes. Just in the last few months, India, Pakistan, all across Southeast Asia, an explosion of fossil fuels have happened, mainly coal and gas. So there's a massive amount of pollution in the air. And we know that what you do here has an impact here, but it's not an immediate impact. It'll be a later impact. And that I think the biggest frustration for me is putting all the pieces together, which is what people really struggle to do. You know, I feel like in Asia, that those of us who've come out of this heat extreme, it's almost like it's forgotten now, and we made it. We'll be all right, because it's going into La Nina, right? But the crop losses, next year, when it gets closer to 50 degrees, are we going to lose the electricity? Therefore, many more people. But the food security issues that are going to really start to, we might not see it this year. We might have enough reserves that we might not see it next year, but at some point the food's going to run out, because, you know, in Europe they've lost it for drought and floods. In the US, same. In Asia, it's heat. So that thinking and the preparation for the heat in the first place is just driving me crazy, because governments think it's just the poor people that are going to be impacted. It's not. And we're seeing it in the US right now.
It's a complete
it's these aspects, you know, where the basic physical things, you know, it gets other things expand out. So what happens is our railway lines that we're laying down, fast trains, ultra fast trains, and so on, the lines are tensioned for a particular temperature range. And so the trains all now have to run slower because we've exceeded that. Otherwise, what happens is the pressure of the train running fast will break the lines, right? The tracks. So it disrupts all of the transport. It disrupts all of the passenger travel. You want to go home and meet your mom, and then you find that actually you're now delayed. Your trains are all delayed and all around. Nobody actually reports and says it's because we live in a physical world, and because we live in a physical world, when things change in it, it affects all of us in our ordinary lives. It's not just the people dying because they're losing the home to a rising sea. The same effect happens at your house. The same effect happens on your road, about things just changing their shape as they get hotter. And because we now work in a world where everything is tuned to perfection, it can only go wrong because we've already tuned it to perfection.
Yeah, for a future that doesn't exist, right?
Yes, and those aspects of it that's never really discussed, never really brought out.
I mean, it's for someone with our background, it's a very alien thought process that you don't really have an idea what will happen if things don't perform as you expected in your portfolio. How do I get rid of the bad stuff and move on and protect my downside, because no one wants to get poorer, and I can still try to capture the upside. What we see around us in all these examples that David mentioning is there is no thought process that says, what if it doesn't work? And for me, that's just an absolutely alien space to occupy, because my first thought is always, what happens if things go wrong? Because I want to know what I'm supposed to do if things go wrong. And once I'm clear about that, then I'm very happy to engage in trying to extract and make as much money as possible from the upside. But you need to have some kind of understanding of the risks you're facing. And what is my approach going to be if things don't exactly pan out as I hoped? And all I see around me are examples of complete lack of thought processes, which has said, what happens if that goes wrong? And to me, it's bonkers.
It's stunning, right?
It's a completely alien parallel universe to which I have spent my 56 years,
Yeah, right. I've been listening to a lot of philosophers lately. So Ian McGilchrist in the UK, and there's a guy I'm about to share a 3-hour interview. Daniel Ratzenberger, I think that's how you say his surname. Have you come across him? He's the guy with the big white beard. And I really encourage people to listen to those sort of people right now, because their job is to understand the story of humanity and how we exist in the world. And I think it sort of answers a lot of questions, but my conclusion is that we've got too many people in leadership positions who are basically sociopathic, their tendencies are, but the other side of it is just incapable of thinking long term. So, when I worked in big corporations, the focus was always the quarter and the year. But then when you live in Asia for a long time, I remember doing a job with SoftBank, and their vision and mission was 30 years, and everything that they did was about moving towards that sort of long-term goal, whereas the Western sort of way of doing things is short-term. But I think we've got a problem with the leadership in the world, politics, business, media, publishers. I think we've got a problem with the quality of the way that people think. And I'm really happy to see the philosophers stepping up, because you can tell they don't want to. Some of them are very uncomfortable in their interviews, but it's like they've all come together and said, we've got a problem. We need to get out there and start speaking up so that we can wake people up before it's too late. I don't know if you saw the European Union, the EU elections. They've really been successful with the young voters. The right-wing and hard right-wing parties are successful with young voters. How did that happen? Well, but seriously, like, their future is not going to be better if they vote that path. And I don't know how that happened.
But it's again, I think, going back to kind of the simplicity of the message and the inability of perhaps scrutinize facts and figures, that if I claim something often enough and I do it in an efficient way and I'm engaging with the people I'm targeting, they will eventually perceive this as being the truth. I think it's just the efficiency of how you deliver that they were better at working at than others. But it's essentially, it's no difference than politics was 100 years ago, right? And we all know what happened in the 30s. So if you say a lie often enough, it eventually becomes the truth because it's not being challenged. So again, the philosophers have a role to play, and we as a society have a role to play.
but that's probably one of the articles that's alarmed me the most. Was just reading it just before we jumped on. Young voters are so pissed off in Europe that they're going to go and vote hard right, and there is no way that's going to be good for them in the long run. From a climate perspective, from a freedom perspective, it's not going to secure their jobs. It's not going to like any of the things that they think that they are voting for. I just don't think are going to be delivered if that's the decision that they make based on history.
No, but young voters everywhere are pretty angry because they, I would say, legitimately, rightly think that our generation have stolen their future because of the choices we made, and perhaps a generation even ahead of us, before us. So they become a very receptive audience for people who might have actually even a good agenda and believe in their agenda, but certainly also for people with a bad agenda that is more about enhancing their own prospect. However, it is very clear to me, as an ardent student of history, that when the mainstream apparatus fails, the mainstream structures of society starts breaking down, for a variety of reasons, people are not going to come to the center. They are going to go left and they're going to go right, and it seldom ends well.
Yeah.
And it's worth bearing in mind. And, I personally, I don't really like far right or far left politics because I think their intellectual arguments don't stand up to scrutiny. And therefore, it doesn't make me mainstream, but it makes me a cross of right and left arguments in how you build a better society. But it's very clear that history tells us that disenchanted, angry young voters are not going to come to the ballot boxes and vote for a mainstream party, and that becomes a real problem for existing politics today. And they better figure out how to tackle it pretty soon.
Yeah. I think for me it was, we're already here, are we? I knew this was coming, but we're already here. Okay. Yeah. All right. Do you want to wrap up? I've seen David, you're talking to the comments on LinkedIn, which is awesome. I usually jump on and do it after the fact because trying to keep it running here. But I want to finish with, so we're going to talk about every 2 weeks going to have to come up with an idea, right? So every time I talk to anyone about this topic, people say to me, what can I do? So if you were going to leave everyone with one tip of what they could do to act positively for the future of humanity and all life on Earth, what would you recommend?
I would basically say what Richard and I are very much doing at the moment, which is to ask yourself, what does it mean for you to thrive with climate change? And allow that to open up the conversations, to open up the materials you're going to look for, to open up the way you're going to think about how you can have the things you enjoy doing, have the situations around you, the community and the places around. And what shape would it actually require? What sort of shape would it actually need? What are the things that you can't have everything? So what goes out the window or stays in that way? And really start thinking about what that thriving with climate change means.
Yeah, very much on the same page. And what I say will probably echo what David just mentioned. But the last part is super important to me in the sense that I think future is going to be quite chaotic, possibly, but certainly challenging for most people because of this structural force that the climate crisis is bringing onto society. And one of the best things you can do is actually focus on what's really important to you and what's kind of nice, but not essential. And start figuring out a world where you safeguard what's really, really important to you and be prepared for how you're going to transit and thrive in that world by holding on to the bits and pieces that really matters to you, because that's what's going to keep you going.
Yeah, I like that. Well, I want to leave my tip in alignment with the theme for today, and it's something I've talked a lot about over the years. If you care about journalism in this space, pay for it. If you can afford to, pay for it. So I have about 6 different subscriptions to media. There's a lot more that I could be paying for, but you can't pay for them all. But I'm committed to investing in the publications that I believe are doing a good job, because I want to help them continue, because I think that they're really, really important. Some are mainstream and some are small. Eco Business, who Robin writes for, I've been subscribed to them, a paying subscriber to them for a couple of years. So I really recommend getting behind them, and it's a really big, it's a great insight into what's going on in this region, and I think it's an important region. The 62% of the world's population lives in this part of the world, so it's an important region to pay attention to, but also to put that lens over the top and understand when you're reading it, to see between the lines like everything else. But yeah, so I think we could do lots more conversations on this, but our next Climate Courage, we're going to talk about climate change and religion, which of course potentially could be a risky topic. I've got Gracious Dennis, and I think he's from Uganda, but we'll find out. I've just met him through Twitter, but I heard him speak on a chat, and it was very interesting. And we've also got Tim Wade joining us, and you guys know Tim from the No Show. And it was Tim and I first started talking about doing this as a show quite a while ago, when we had some commentary on on social media, basically saying, stop it, you don't need to talk about this, God will sort it out. And I found that an incredibly ignorant perspective. Tim found it an alarming perspective. So that's where it kind of started from, and we're seeing what the Pope's doing. We're seeing what the leadership in the Muslim faith are doing. I'm trying to secure someone from the Muslim faith to come and join us. I haven't succeeded yet. If you've got any ideas of people who are spiritual, religious, no, I want to focus on religion. So we've got Richard. Are you an atheist?
No, I'm not. But I have some atheist streaks in my belief. But
tendencies.
That's right.
Yeah, tendencies. So, yes.
So you David, you're Catholic, right?
Yeah. Yes.
So a practicing Catholic.
Yes,
Richard?
Yes.
No, not practicing. No.
Okay. All right. So all right. So I was raised with Catholicism. So but I would put myself in the agnostic basket these days. So I want to get a group of us that can sort of represent it, some who are actively practicing as well as those who are not. But I think it's an important topic within the conversation, and I think the churches and the temples and the mosques are incredibly important places in the world where some powerful conversations and changes could be happening. So yeah, I'm looking forward to that. Are you looking forward to that?
I think what would be interesting, and Richard and I should try and reach out and see if we can. I don't know if anyone from the Faith Invest group is listening, which are a group that's involving all the faiths with regards to their investments and how that how to give power of their faith to their investments, basically.
Right, okay.
And I think it would be nice to see whether we can actually connect to any of them on that. So maybe we should, Richard and I, we should try sending out an invitation or two.
Yeah, you can certainly do that. And yeah, like you said, they're multi-faith really. So
they're very much multi-faith.
So
I mean, they
Yeah, Gracious will definitely talk about the multi-faith approach to climate communication in Africa, and that's what I found really compelling about his discussion. And so if you've got anyone else, or if you're out there and you're listening and you think this is a conversation that you want to be part of, it's not we don't attack anyone here for their ideas. We listen and we hear each other, and we have opposing views, which is very welcome. But I'm really looking forward to that. So, all right. Show number 2.
Yes,
indeed.
That would be great. Yep. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.
We're looking forward to number 3.
And contributing to the comments. Just build that up. Next time we can get more.
Yeah, no, definitely. So yeah, it's been great to see all the comments. So have a great weekend, everyone. We'll see you in 2 weeks.
See you. Yep.
See you.
See you then. Bye.